Thank you so much. It's been 2 years since I was here, and first, a giant thank you to all of you because as you know, Phil was mentioning earlier, knowing your story and even knowing your origin story, Coastal Church has become a part of. I think I've got more than one thing in me, but that could just be pride. But this thing I'm going to be sharing with you, and it kind of really took form in preparing for being here 2 years ago. So giant thankful, and thank you to Coastal because you guys are part of my story now. Some of the stories I'm going to share today, I may have shared last time, but not everyone here was here last time, and I felt like this is always how I want to introduce this. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about telling your story and how to do it. And what structurally does that look like, how to approach it, and how, as you're at home or you're with friends, you can do that. And so I begin with a part of my story. This was a number of years ago. I was home alone in my apartment, and there was a knock at the door. And I went to the door, and you know those little holes you can look through where you can see through and see the people on the outside? I looked outside, and the one thing that I can tell you is it always makes the person on the outside look a lot smaller than they really are. So I opened the door, and plus you can only see one person, and there were three. And all three pushed their way into my apartment looking for drugs and money. And they kept on referring to me, and, you know, we're here for this, we're not going to hurt you. But as they pushed their way into my apartment, I pushed my way through them out into the hallway. So now these three guys were on the inside, and I was on the outside. So one of them stayed on the inside, and two of the other guys came out. And those two guys were like, just go in the apartment, we don't want to hurt you, we're just here for, you know, the drugs and the money. And I said, you know, I'm not going in there with you. I kept on hearing stories, or I had heard stories about people who try to protect their car and then end up, you know, really hurt as a result. And so I said, I'm not going to go in there with you. And the one guy was like, what's your name? I said, it's Jim. And he said, no, it's not, it's Bill. And I said, well, I have ID in there, and, you know, and they're like, well, go and get it. And I said, well, no, I said I'm not going to go in there with you, but you can go in there, and you can, there's a stereo there. You could take that if you wanted. I said it was a wedding gift, but it's not a very good marriage I have right now. Not Ashley, but not a very good marriage right now. So you could take that, and they're like, we're here for the drugs and the money. Go and get it for us. I said no, and then they said, well, you better do what we say because he has a gun. And he pointed to the second guy in the hall. So that guy then, and I said, well, let me see it. And then that guy pulled out a gun. And now all of a sudden it was here, and I was, you know, the first thing I had thought about at that moment was, or the first thing that hit me at that moment was how my wife at the time had said that she was praying to God that I would die in a car accident. And I'm like, God's answering her prayer. It's not a car accident, but that's so unfair. What kind of God answers prayers like that? And then the second thing that went through my mind was my mom's love for all the old religious films like Quo Vadis, where they're leading out all the Christians to be mauled and attacked by lions, and they're all singing hymns and stuff like that. And I was like, so what am I supposed to do here? I was like, I know. I'll take a stand for God, and that'll get me into heaven. And then I remembered that, no, Jim, no, that's not how you get in heaven. It's like you can't earn your way to heaven. You have to receive it as a gift. You're so pathetic. And then I thought, but maybe God will see how pathetic I am, but knowing everything that I know, will say, well, just have mercy on me anyhow. Despite everything. So there's the guy with the gun, and the second guy had gone into the apartment, and they were looking for drugs and money, certainly, going through everything. And I just looked at the guy, and I said, I'm so afraid that you're going to shoot me, and I'm going to die. And so before you do that, I want you to know God loves you. Jesus loves you. And the guy looked at me and goes, and the gun was like this, and it went like that. And he was like, oh, shit. And it was shit as he ran down the hall and out the door. I may never know. I may never know what that word was that he was saying. But then those other two guys were still in my apartment. So I started pounding on other people's doorways, in this apartment building, hoping someone would let me in. And finally a guy came to the door, and I called the cops from his place, and the cops were on their way, and I thanked him, and then he said, no problem, my name is Bill. We're talking a lot about stories. We're talking a lot about how do you tell your stories if you're doing it as a business or a brand or as an individual. And what I'm going to focus here is how do you tell your story? And why is it why is it important, and why it's really something that is your way individually. Not even talking about corporately as a church, but your way individually to change the world and change people's lives. Now, I didn't have this 2 years ago, but thankfully other people have brought it to my attention as I've been sharing this. There's even a verse in the Bible that talks about how important your testimony is. And it's in Revelations 12:11. It says, they triumphed over him being the accuser, the devil, anyone who would really keep this world down. They triumph over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Other verses or other translations may use the word overcome instead of triumph, or they'll say conquered instead of triumph. But it's the blood of the Lamb, which is what we put our faith into, and then it's your testimony. Your story. What this ultimately means is that as Christians, I believe that we are the only people group on the face of the planet who've been called to all be storytellers, for at least our story. I'm not saying that everyone should go into movies, there's too many other good filmmakers out there who are already stealing my jobs. I don't want any of you to go into film, okay? But you have a story to tell, and the more of you tell your stories, the more that affects how people understand things. And the truth is, as I've listened to testimonies, as I've talked to people over the years, as I've kind of looked at things, we really don't know how to tell stories. We just haven't been taught how to do it. We've never, even somehow thought through how we have a responsibility to be able to tell why we believe and who we are and how we've come to be this place. I have a friend named Dave who a number of years ago, we were hanging out, and he goes, Jim, do you know what my biggest regret is? And I said, no, tell me. And he goes, I regret that I saved myself for marriage. And I was like, oh, what a bad regret. I'm like, isn't that kind of the idea? Isn't that kind of, who we as believers, that's part of it, that's part of our faith, and stuff like that. And I said, really, you're not very imaginative. If that's it, or you know what? And fortunately, Dave's a good Lutheran, so it took a couple beers later, but I got to what was really at the center of Dave's biggest regret. And Dave's biggest regret was that he grew up in the church. And because he grew up in the church, he didn't have that moment where he woke up naked in a river and was like, wow, I need Jesus. He didn't have a testimony to share. He didn't have a story to tell, he felt. And, I grew up in the church, but fortunately, I was held at gunpoint and spent a night in the penitentiary and, had abandonment and all kinds of things that helped me. But, I grew up in the church, and I have to, I have to wonder how many of us feel like we don't have a story to tell because we don't have, those fantastic moments or those fantastic giant things. And when we do the session tomorrow, Dave and I are going to be scouting out a couple people who don't feel like they have a story, and we're going to do a live workshop on stage trying to find your story and help you discover your story and help you find out the testimony and develop that. So we're looking for people who are believers who don't feel like they have a story to tell. So come and talk afterwards. Yeah. And I think even having this idea of I don't have a story to tell, what I see in other Christians specifically is shame and sadness. And I'm like, you were raised in the church and you're sad? That makes me think of Martin Luther, going back to the Lutheran thing again, who said, if you're a Christian, it's better to be drunk than sad. Sadness is the one thing, it may be the cardinal sin of being a Christian. We can be a man of sorrows like Christ was, but we can't be sad. Because if we're sad, we're missing out on what Jesus did. We're somehow so disconnected from the Spirit that we shouldn't even be telling people our testimonies if we're sad. So, responding to what Phil said about the 4 things, if you remember yesterday, the 4 things that, these can all be jump points to your life, it made me so mad that my friend Dave and that other people were ashamed, not of the gospel, but they were ashamed of how the gospel hadn't impacted their life. That it made me think, this can't even be true. This can't even be right. As a result, we just haven't had the training, as I said. So how would someone who was raised in the church, how would any of us tell our stories? And you know what? If I sit listening to a person speak for a half hour about their life story, I get bored. If I listen to them talk 45 minutes about their story, or an hour, there better be some sort of food involved. And sometimes testimonies are best told over lunch between 2 people, or best told over a coffee or a tea or something else if you're with your Lutheran friends. And what's ironic in the midst of this is I'm in LA, I'm working on animation for Disney. I've got a first look deal on a different project with Fox, and I've gotten to hone in the last number of years my pitching abilities. And I realized that this is life as a writer in LA. Your agent or your manager goes out and they set up a pitch. You haven't written the script yet, but you've prepared for it. You go out, and before you ever really write your script, you have to tell someone it. You have to tell someone the story. So you have to learn how to tell your story. And then they tell someone else, and they tell someone else. So if your story goes too long or there's too many details, they're going to lose the details and screw up your story so that someone else that it ultimately needs to be heard from doesn't get to hear it the right way. So your story has to be simple. It needs to be understandable. It needs to be something that someone else can tell someone else. So you get 20 minutes tops to tell your story, which keeps it from getting boring, even if it is an adventure story. Even if you do have your waking up naked in a river stories, or moments of it. So you get 20 minutes, and you get 20 minutes in the hope that someone will buy that story. And as believers, that's how you want to be too. You want to tell your story in the hopes that someone buys it. Yeah. in the hopes that someone believes it and trusts that there's something here. I'm jumping ahead in my schedule, in my outline, but I think this is the right place to put it. You know, the problem is a lot of times we think our story is supposed to somehow win someone to Christ. And so what we put in our testimonies is we put a bunch of verses, you know, we do John 3:16, you know, for God so loved the world, you know, that he gave, you know, and we go on, and that's really nice, and we hope, by just that verse, someone will hear and be like, you know, but most people respond with like, well, I don't want him loving the world, I want him loving me. And then you don't want them rewriting scripture, so you get really frustrated and kind of defensive, so verses become kind of problematic. And then there's science. You're like, oh, well, you know, you try to explain all the arguments you've heard from smarter people about why you can't trust science, but then there's new theories that the other person, if they're smart, will come back to you and say, yeah, but that science doesn't really, well, what about this theory? What about this theory? Have you thought about this? And then you have no response, and so you respond by them being smarter with another verse. You cannot trust in the things of man, you know. And then you get defensive again, and you're lost again. Or there's the logic thing. There's the logic thing where you'll argue for, you know, and you'll say, oh, but what about this, you know? Or they'll bring you a question and they'll be like, well, can God create a rock so big that he can't move it? And then you're like, well, you know, and then you try to out-clever them. My favorite example is, you know, they're like, yeah, well, if the Bible's so trustworthy, where did Cain get his wife? And then you can say, oh, well, I tell you if I was able. But really? Really? You want to win, you want your story to be, or you want to win someone to at least consider the possibility that you're not a complete idiot for following Christ by being a little more clever? Is that what we believe in? Do we put our trust in cleverness? That's good. Come on. Revelation 12:11, again, the second half of it, by the word of their testimony. So, putting all this stuff together, because once upon a time I was good at math, here it is, how to tell your testimony like a Hollywood pitch. You have 20 minutes. And your structure goes something like this. This is how a film works. I'll reference, like, I think Star Wars or something like that to help it. Couple things that I want to say. You should never, I'll do the never in a testimony. And part of if you've had any training like me in the past as far as how to tell your testimony, it kind of comes off as a Catholic confessional. And you spend 80% of your testimony talking about all the stuff you did before you became a Christian. And not even who you were, just the stuff you did. Oh, yeah, I partied a lot, I did this. And it reminds me of this thing about the guy who said, you know, he became a Christian after years of, you know, fast cars, faster women, lots of money, and extravagant mansions. I'm like, why couldn't I become a Christian that way? It's not about what you had. It's not at all. And in Hollywood, if you went in with a pitch on your story, and 80% of it, which means the first hour and a half, was all about who you were before you became a Christian, they wouldn't buy it. That means if you have 20 minutes, that means you have to become a Christian in your testimony 25% of the way into it. In fact, if it's a 20-minute testimony, you have to become a Christian 5 minutes into your testimony. Because a testimony isn't about what you did. A testimony is about what God has done. So you're going to start, and I don't know, there are maybe 10 steps to this, 10 steps to your testimony. None of us are, the end of our story isn't here yet. Maybe our finale isn't here yet. So you're not going to be able to tell a beginning, a middle, and a finite end, but you are going to be able to tell a beginning, a middle, and a sense of end, a sense of where you are right now. So you begin with your introduction. It's an opening image. It's an idea of who you were at the beginning. And, again, I want to say who you were for your testimony is so much more important than what you did. Because if you give me all the stuff about what you did, at some point in your list, I'm going to start thinking, well, I know you now, and what you used to do is so much more interesting than what you do. And so you can potentially rob the glory of what God has done in your life from your testimony. So you start with an introduction. You start with your opening image. And what that opening image might be is it might be your favorite toy as a child, or the first thing you remember you were really afraid of. And I say this because the things that we fear when we're children are often our first gods. If we fear losing something, if we fear losing our parents, as a child, it's because that's the thing that no matter what would happen, that's the thing that if that was taken away from us, we'd be lost. Or we fear not having money, if it starts a little later. But it begins with who you were, maybe your childhood dreams, what you wanted to be when you were a child or young, or, what your fears were, what life was when you were just growing up. In my case, I was incredibly sheltered, I was raised totally in the Christian bubble, I think the first time I even went to, my high school Bible study, everyone was so upset about Keith Green's plane crashing that I didn't know who Keith Green was, so I just kind of lied and was like, yeah, it's terrible. And it was, but then everyone else was like, well, God took Keith Green, but he brought us Amy Grant. But it was in that, I was still in that bubble, and that kind of thing was just perpetuating the bubble. The idea of just, oh no, keep it Christian music, keep it this. And so I was so cloistered. Now, that's maybe 2 minutes of your testimony. That's why I mean, it's so, you just don't get a lot of time to do, your top 10 list of worst sins. And hopefully, for the sake of your testimony, the worst parts of your life are going to happen when you become a Christian. You have to also include something that in a script would be called a catalyst. It's the moment where the way your life had been kind of set up, something threatened to change it. Something changed. It may be, for someone, it may be I went to, back when they had them, someone took me to church. Or I lost a family member. Or I lost my job. I love that Phil didn't have to grow up till he was 36. That's so cool. I had to grow up when I was 32. I'm so upset about that. I was hoping to never have to at all. But, it's something that threatens to change everything or most everything you believed in the past. And if you were raised in the church, where's that point? For me, it was that night of the gun because, there I was. I had, kind of done everything right. I had, followed Christ. I had done my best to be the believer that everyone had told me I should be, and I believed and I prayed the prayers wanting to really believe in God, but, my God was too small. So for those of us raised in the church, our gods are too small until something happens to change that. In your story, where was that moment, I guess, when you realized your God was too small? Where was that moment where God had to be more than just going to Bible studies and going to, being part of the choir and stuff? Where was that moment where everything began to switch? And then after that, in your testimony, there's a little sense of doubt. It's like, no, you kind of rewrite, you kind of say, no, that couldn't be, no, I'm doing everything right. I'm going to church, I'm doing this, everything's right. But at some point, your break from Act 1 to Act 2 in the midst of a story is you ultimately saying, I'm a Christian, I'm going to follow Christ, or God becomes more real. If you were to do this in business, and not even as believers, but I so rarely get to really talk to churches on this subject. Specifically, it's usually how do you develop a story and that kind of thing. But in businesses, this would be, where's the point where your business had its vision and when you first started acting on that vision? So that's your first 5 minutes. You still have 15 minutes to talk. You can have a shorter testimony. You can do it in 15, 16 minutes, but that just means your intro has to be shorter. Because this is the way stories go. What's interesting is there I was, at like 23 in a really bad marriage, but I did everything right. I just didn't believe that anyone would lie to get into marriage. And there I was in a job that about 2 months after this I was going to lose, which ultimately would lead me to Marvel Comics. But, at the time it was devastating. And there I was. Death had come to my door. Like the bubble of Christianity was not very protective. And it was easily popped. And yet at the same time that night, God became bigger. God became more than I had thought. And so many times I think even in our churches, God, we kind of trade God for the idea of family safety. And God's, he's anything but safe. So you have 15 minutes and left to tell in your testimony, and that means that 75% of your testimony better be about what God has done in your life and what's happened since you have gotten involved with him. So the elements of the rest of your story include things like this. What was it like when you first became a Christian? Did you feel different? Did something make sense that had never made sense before? Were you scared? And, one of the best parts is how did your friends feel? How did they feel about it? Was it weird because you had this, this thing you wanted to tell them about, you wanted to share with them about, and all of a sudden they wanted no piece of it? They wanted no part of it. They didn't want to hear you talk about this, and you began to see that you began to lose friends. That this thing you had been given and grabbed onto, this good news that you wanted to share with everyone else in the world, that they had been just like you before, and they didn't want to hear it either. And what was that like for them? You see, I have this theory, and I think it's been proved every time I look at it, that people don't really care about heaven. Maybe they did years and years ago. I think the theory people, or I think that most people just want to know, does Jesus make a difference right now? When I've lost a job, does Jesus make a difference in that? When I've lost a girlfriend, does Jesus make a difference? When I've lost a family member, does Jesus make a difference? Or just even just being bummed out, or things not going great, or getting rear-ended by a car, or being tight about paying rent. Does Jesus make a difference? Because, man, we sure hope he does. Isn't that the hope? That we're not, that even though it kind of looks like we're stupid for following Christ, that it doesn't. It reminds me of my favorite VeggieTales moment. There's this moment where it's the one where they're doing the Battle of Jericho, and the peas are all on top. If you don't know VeggieTales, it's all animated vegetables that tell Bible stories, and they're doing Jericho, and there are these French peas. I don't know. I don't know why they're drinking Slurpees, but they're drinking Slurpees, and they're at the top of the wall around Jericho, and the other vegetables are doing their walk around, and the French peas are throwing their Slurpees down at them. That's their defense of Jericho. And there's a point where the gourd looks up at the French peas, who are saying, "You're so stupid for marching around and playing your songs." And the gourd looks up at them and says, "We're not stupid. Our God told us to do this." Which may be, the ridiculous situation we as believers so often find ourselves. We're not stupid. Our God tells us to do this. And you know what? In your testimony, there's that too. But you know what? People want to know, getting back to this idea, that it makes a difference. And so you have to tell them in your testimony, because this is a testimony about what God has done, now what you've done, and this is the confessional part. This is the part where you can share, when I first became a Christian, I made a lot of mistakes. This is the point where you can say and be free to say, I really shoved it down people's throats. It's not my fault that they threw up afterwards and wanted nothing to do with me. And you can even say, you know what? God must have just looked at me and said, ugh, did I make a mistake bringing him into the flock at that point? Was that someone who turned other people away because of what they said? And, in the midst of it, you have to realize that, some people, we just get so enthused about this good news we want to share and the story we want to share and the fact that we feel like we've been saved, that we just go out and we forget that we're talking to another human being while we're telling them our story. And, all of filmmaking, all of telling stories is connecting with an audience. All of it is finding out how to relate our story to them in a way that's going to be meaningful for them. Other parts of your testimony have to include a moment, where you doubted. At the beginning, in those first 5 minutes, when there was the catalyst that suggested that something in your life was going to change, there's a little moment where you're doubting. There's a moment to share your doubt and say, okay, well, you know what, maybe things aren't the way they're supposed to be, or, that kind of thing. And then here's another moment where doubt has to come back, because doubt is part of the faith walk. Doubt is part of questioning. Questions lead to growth. And a lot of times we get so afraid of asking questions, that we stop even growing. And that's part of it. So you need to share your doubts. And you need to share a time when it seemed like this new faith you have, this trust in God, didn't seem to work. And you need to share that. Because you know what? A lot of people don't want to start believing or even trusting because they feel like, well, what if I doubt? I don't want to start believing in something if I'm all of a sudden then not going to believe in it. I don't want to start believing, then having all these friends, turn on me, and then all of a sudden, have to go back to them and go, yeah, okay, it was a mistake. Yeah, no, I really do like drugs. Yeah, please. Those kind of things are, like, doubt is part of the faith walk. And what you're doing when you're telling your story like this is you're letting someone else know that you worship a God who's big enough to let you doubt. You're worshiping a God who's big enough to work through trouble when it comes into your life. Oh, and here's almost another essential part of your testimony, and this should even work into kind of your conclusion. I said before that you can't do really a conclusion because you're not dead, or you're still in the midst of your career. You need to have moments in which you show some sort of movement towards something. So if you began your life, as a child wanting to become a doctor, let's say, and now you're working in accounting, I'm not saying, necessarily this is a good example because I was just making this one here. You don't want to talk necessarily about how now you doctor the books, because that's going to, suggest all kinds of deceit, which isn't necessarily going to help your testimony about what God's done in your life. But you want to show how this isn't just about a faith journey. This is about who you are. This is about what it's like to have the God of the universe get involved in your life and begin to transform it and make you into the person you never even dreamed you could become as a child. You want to have a moment in conclusion of your testimony of what difference God has made in your life. When did it work? And I'm not saying you sit there and go like, yeah, God's just made a difference in my life and now I'm part of the choir. That's like the old version of testimonies where, yeah, I did this and this and this and this, woke up naked in a river, and now I'm a member of the choir. Don't you want to believe? That's ridiculous. You want to tell a real story, and this is where you go into some of the details. You want to tell a story about how you lost someone close to you, and you were always, and go back to that fear that you never wanted to be alone, and you're like, in the midst of this, yeah, I never felt so alone, but I also didn't feel alone. Because this goes back to other people wanting to know that God makes a difference. And here's the amazing part of telling a testimony and telling your testimony. The more you tell it, the better it gets. The more, and I'm not talking about like that telephone story where you pass one story to another person and the story gets bigger and bigger and more ridiculous. No, the more you tell it, the more you become convinced that God has always been working and working all things to make who you are. And the more you realize that, there was one lady that I did a workshop with who was like, I don't have a story. And I was like, well, where did you grow up? And she said, I grew up on a farm. And I was like, okay, so did you help animals grow? And did you help raise them? And she goes, no, my parents really didn't trust me with that. So I'm like, oh, okay, so I can't talk about now as a believer, you helping people grow. Okay, what else can you do? And she goes, well, I cut the grass, but not really. And she's like, I kind of sat around. And I said, what was the worst thing as a child that you did? And she said, my parents made me shovel the manure. I'm like, oh, okay. So on the inside, I'm like, okay, this is really good. This is really good. I'm like, so now, and she's like, yeah, I've been married, everything's good, he and I are good, And it's like, it was torture trying to drag it out of her, but at the same time was a sadness that she didn't have a story to tell. And I said, well, how do you relate to people? And she goes, I said, if you don't have anything to complain about in your life, or you don't feel the story, so you really don't feel like you have anything to talk about God, and all that sort of thing. And she goes, well, I pretty much so just listen to my friends. She used the word shit. And I said, oh, do you realize who God has made you from the very beginning? You're a collector of people's manure. You take it, and you move it somewhere. And that's how you allow them to grow and move on. And I was like, and that is Christ-like too. And the next day, the woman came to me, and she was like teary-eyed, and she was like, I never thought I had a story to tell. My mom has a similar story to this, and recently I wrote a story about her. In the last couple of years, I think I may have even left some Xeroxes here last time I was here for people to share, about a doll that had been kind of ripped off from her by a bratty girl in just post-Nazi occupied Germany, and how she ultimately gave that girl, and was forced to give that girl the doll, which was her only prized possession, and about how 50 years later, when she was visiting Germany, now as an old lady, that woman had saved the head of the doll and gave it back to her. And had said, I've raised my children wanting to know, telling them over and over not to ever covet what anyone else has. And how there was that lesson there. And my mom said to her, well, I've raised my children with the lesson of never wanting to hold on to anything too tightly because things get taken away. And the two women talked about how this stupid little doll, and it's better in the story than the way, had really changed generations to come. Your stories can have that, but it's about finding the thing you love, like that thing you were afraid of or loved as a child may even hold the key to who you are today and what God has done in your life. Because our first idols, the things that keep us from Him, if He has His hands on us, He's going to make us face those fears. He's going to figure out some sort of way in our lives to make us have to get rid of those idols that are keeping us from all the good things He wants to do. And that's classic filmmaking. If a film if it begins like Star Wars begins with Luke Skywalker, who's so afraid of, leading, he's so afraid of leading the boring life, he wants to be like his father. And in the midst of the change, he comes to see that he's not leading the boring life, but he wants to be like his father, and that will be his destruction. That was his idol, to be like his dad. Once he found out that his dad was this great star fighter and pilot, he just wanted that. It was innate. And then if he was become like his father, he would become, the worst villain there was in the galaxy. It's the whole process of your testimony needs to show how God, not only, it's not about saving you from hell, but saving you from the smallness your life was destined for. He brings life and life abundant. I love that Phil this morning said that people love an origin story when it comes to superhero movies, because your testimony is your origin story. Your testimony is your origin story of how you became this finite speck of a being, like out of Horton Hears a Who, and how the great God Horton heard you when no one else could and saved you and made you a giant. Tonight, I hope you're all going to come because we're going to watch Iron Man, and myself and Phil and Gordon are going to add in our own impromptu commentary on the film. And this is the origin of Iron Man movie. And we're going to talk about the spiritual aspects in it. We're going to talk about how to be symbol-minded, how to watch movies and be exposed to stories, and how to take every thought in there captive, and how to think about it and approach it and see that we live in a world where almost all story speaks to some sort of truth the more we pay attention to it. And both Gordon and Dave are always telling me, and this is my conclusion, about Superman and Batman. And since there probably won't be a chance tonight, I thought I'd close with this. We were on a trip to Disneyland, or Disney World, when I was very young. I was 6, my brother was 4, and my mom and dad, or my dad actually, got my brother and I a comic book, and this is part of my opening. This would be my opening image in my testimony, and how my brother, he got Batman. And my dad got me Superman. And, Batman's got this great origin, he's rich, and then, they go and they see Zorro, and then on the way home, his parents are killed, and just like Zorro or the Count of Monte Cristo swears that he'll use all this wealth to fight crime for the rest of his days and get revenge and get justice on his parents, that's not really Superman's story. Yes, Krypton explodes, if you don't know the Superman story. But Superman's just, he's a little baby in the rocket, so he doesn't remember any of that. The rocket comes to our world and, and basically, crash lands, and a really nice farm family finds him, and, they're Methodists. It's an ideal childhood. And then, he gets to, the city, he gets to Metropolis, and ultimately, he meets Lois Lane, and ultimately, he puts on this suit, which they've kind of refactored the origin of Superman now, and Superman's mom made him the suit. Isn't that cute? Not the mom from Krypton, the good Methodist mom. And I'm not picking on Methodists, only for humor's sake. And then, someone pulls a gun on him and fires, and the bullet bounces off him. Oh, poor Superman. Not a very vital story. Not a story that changes people's lives. Because the first time you try to climb up to the top of, your shed and jump off to fly like Superman, it doesn't work out so good. I know, I tried to breathe underwater like Aquaman for a long time, and it didn't work out so good. Well, but the Superman I'd like to see, if I could rewrite the origin of Superman, was that Superman would not be a baby. He would not be a baby when he left Krypton. He'd be like 6, 7 years old, the same age young Bruce Wayne would be, and there would be the world falling apart around him, and Superman's parents would be pushing him into the rocket, trying to save his life, but he would rather not even have the rocket than just be with them for the last couple moments. So he's fighting them, and they're struggling, and to save him, they shove him in the rocket, and the rocket takes off with him, tears streaming down his eyes, screaming for his parents, seeing in the back his entire world explodes. He comes here, and he's racked by this super hearing. He's tortured by it. And they did that a little bit in the last Superman movie. But all he has is nightmares of losing his parents, nightmares of his world exploding, and everything he had ever built his life upon being taken from him. He knows what it's like to lose a planet. And so he vows himself that he's never going to let this planet be lost. It's a completely different primal change for Superman. He gets shot by a bullet. The bullet bounces off him, but then hits someone else next to him. He's not bulletproof. In fact, he's got to be worried where every other bullet lands. Anytime someone shoots a bullet at him, it could be someone else killed, someone else harmed. There could be thousands of deaths just as a result of him being bulletproof, which makes him a cursed being. And you know what? He hears our prayers. He hears our cries for help, the things that sometimes are so inaudible that we just say as whispers. And he responds, and he says, he responds to the one that's closest, to him that he can answer immediately. But he goes to that one, that 1 in 10, and saves them, but then here's the other 9 pleas for help, ultimately end. And he realizes that he can't save everyone. And he's racked by this. When he saves people, classically in the comics, he'd rescue someone, and he'd give them a wink, and he'd give them a little grin, to say everything's going to be okay. Well, I still want him to do that. But on the inside, he knows what's really going on. He has a fortress of solitude that he goes to, and he goes to that fortress of solitude just to keep his sanity, to block out all the other screams and cries for help in the world. But even while he's there, he feels guilty because of all the cries for help that he can't answer, but he does it to keep his sanity. You and I worship a God who can't just save 1 in 10, He can save all of them. It took his blood as sacrifice, but it also takes our testimonies. Our testimonies should be practiced. Not only do you work these things out, but you have to practice them, if only to make sure it's good, if only to build your own faith, encourage your own faith, and encourage your own conviction. And what's great is you're part of a community here. You're part of a community here in which you can, like 3 of you can get together really easily and just, here's where my testimony is, here's where my testimony is, and share your stories with each other and make them better. And, just in the telling of it, it gets better. Because what's really interesting is, you hear one story about, if someone hears 4 or 5 testimonies about how God became personal in 4 or 5 different people's lives, even if it's not at once, even if 1 year they hear one testimony, 2 years later, a different friend's a Christian, they hear that testimony, all of a sudden, God isn't just a God who forgives sins. And shame on us for making him into that.